This video is powered by, as always, entertainment. If you enjoyed this content, consider becoming a patron over on patreon.com/asalways for access to the Patreon exclusive podcast, The Kill Connor Clubhouse, early access to the Cinema Room podcast, being part of polls for future videos, and other early access material. With that said, please enjoy the video. When it launched, Spider-Man PS4 was one of my favourite games of 2018. Due to all the great games that released that year, it wasn't my favourite, but it was up there, and as a Spider-Man fan, it meant so much to me. But recently, within the last few months, I was talking to someone who asked what I thought of Spider-Man, and my response, without even thinking, was, yeah, it was fine, I guess. And then I thought to myself, wait, no, what? It wasn't just fine. I'm pretty sure it was fantastic. No, I remember it was fantastic. So why do I still feel like it was just okay? It wasn't until recently with the launch of the final DLC, Silver Lining. Yeah, I know, it's February 2019. I'm sorry, I take too long with these. It wasn't until recently with the launch of the final DLC, Silver Lining, that it dawned on me why I had this weird disconnect to how I felt about Spider-Man PS4 just after release. The DLC for Spider-Man PS4 was not up to scratch with the rest of the game, in a way that spoiled the original game, along with potentially fucking up any sequels coming down the line. I know this might sound drastic, but please don't hate me. This is all just speculation and wild thinking. I still love Spider-Man PS4, and I cannot wait for the future. I'm just addressing some of the issues that I've found, and how it's affecting my overall thinking of Marvel's Spider-Man as a whole, and how it could affect the future. Oh, also, this video contains spoilers for the whole game and the DLC, so if you don't want spoilers, you should probably click off this video. Before we begin, I want to give a big thank you to our Patreon producers, King Richard III, Josh Devillier, and Seth. Thanks for the support, guys. Right, now then, let's go. The original game of Marvel's Spider-Man launched on September 7th, 2018 and was met with critical acclaim. I even dropped a review stating it was my favourite superhero game of all time, which I'll link below if you're interested. The base game to this day is one of the best games out there on this console generation, and certainly still is my favourite superhero game, unless we're counting Saints 4 Re-Elected, which in that case, oh boy, no, I'm joking. Could you imagine if that was my favourite superhero game? That'd throw all my criticisms out of whack. The open world content for Spider-Man was decent, with it mostly being there to give the player a reason to do things in the open world in between story missions, and try to expand on the game beyond a regular linear experience. They do this fine in the base game. It's not the best open world by any means in terms of the content, and the Arkham games do this far better, giving all the villain side stories for you to do whenever you choose, but Spider-Man did the best it could for the first installment, and it was just fine, especially when the main focus was the story missions, and the main story was fantastic. Now bear this in mind, because what I've said here is really one of the main issues when it comes to the DLC of Spider-Man. Moving on now to the main story, it was a very narrative heavy, very dramatic, very character focused game, and all of that worked so well. Like I said, the side content and the open world content complemented this, and everything went hand in hand. It felt as if we were being told a story from a movie or comic or TV show, and it was brilliant. The way the story was told set up lots of points for sequels, as well as left us on cliffhangers for sequels too, which was exciting, keeping us waiting for whatever was coming next. Remember how I said before to remember this point? Well, I want you to remember this point too. This is your homework. Take it all in. It's important for later. If you forget, you're going to be confused and lost, and nah, not really, but just keep this in the back of your mind, eh? Anyway, the last major point that's relevant for this video from the main story of Spider-Man is the setup of Miles. They set up how he now has spider powers from the lab at Oscorp, basically telling us he's going to play a major role in the future Spider-Man games, which is great. Can't wait. Awesome stuff. Hype for the sequel. Now, this is where the DLC comes into play, because you see, this DLC wasn't just extra stories that might have taken place at some point in the main story, little side stories that Spider-Man did at some point. That's the same thing. I just said the same thing. They're actually technically sequels. They make it very clear that these stories are set after the main story of the game, which in a way is great. They're direct continuations, but in other ways, it isn't so great. With everything that was set up in Spider-Man's main story, it doesn't exactly lend itself to mini stories told as sequels, but we'll get onto that shortly. First, let's go over the DLCs themselves. Remember when I told you to remember all those various points I made? Well, I hope you took notes and did your homework, because that comes into play here. For starters, let's talk about the structure of Spider-Man's DLC split across 3 chapters. I'm doing air quotes around chapters. You can't see that, but I'm trying to imply that they don't really work like chapters. So the first chapter was the heist. In this chapter, you meet Black Cat and you find out she has a kid. Crazy stuff, I know. And she's supposedly stealing all these secret paintings for Hammerhead because he's stolen her child, and he's basically threatening to kill her child if she doesn't comply. And this sends you all over New York doing what are objectively side content missions until you finally realize, oh no, Black Cat, the criminal, who lies all the time was lying and to you. She doesn't have a kid, she steals Hammerhead's drive for herself, does you in, and then you flee to save her from Hammerhead, only to find her entering a building and she blows up. You assume this is where episode 2, Turf Wars, will pick up, but it doesn't at all. These chapters, I'm doing the air quotes again, anyways, these chapters are more like individual episodic side quests, which have a thin narrative thread, but all focus on different things, and so the idea that this was one whole story is lost. Turf Wars, for the most part, completely forgets about Black Cat and the drives, and focuses on Hammerhead's gang. Most of the gameplay in this DLC is incredibly boring, with it being again stretched out side quest material along with eavesdropping missions like this is Assassin's Creed. This chapter focuses on a weird sub-story of Yuri being really angry at Hammerhead and becoming somewhat of a villainous character, potentially setting up her to become the comic book villain of Wraith in the future installments, but who knows. It's quickly left by the wayside until the very end, where she has an epic gamer rage moment and annihilates Hammerhead. The moment itself was good, but it didn't feel earned, and it all pretty much came out of nowhere, and honestly comes off as pretty silly in the end. We then end on a cliffhanger that, oh no, Hammerhead is alive. Sorry, I even got, yeah, that, well, crazy. Now this is really the point when I realised these side stories are not good enough to support the game on their own. The storyline isn't compelling enough or joined together enough to feel like it even stands as a story on its own in the same way the main story of the game did. But that's what they try to do, giving you a different map for each of the DLCs. It's the same New York, but I mean they just have their own side missions for the DLC, so it's not the same map that you explore in the main game. It's the same map environment because it's New York. It's just like a different New York with different side quests that's specific to each DLC. I don't know, I couldn't tell you why they did that. And in doing so means it essentially works as a separate mini game, but the gameplay loop of doing a main mission, doing a few side activities, then doing another main mission that works so well for the main game isn't really present here, but they present it in the same way. The main missions for these DLCs are not nearly as enjoyable or unique to play, and the story itself isn't nearly as compelling. The main missions feel like side missions for the most part, and that means you're just doing, or what it feels like doing, tons of side missions, and no matter how fun the core elements of the gameplay are, having a structure like that means you're doing something wrong. Now, like I said early on, it wasn't until Silver Lining launched that I realised the issue, because Silver Lining to me didn't suffer from the same issues that the other two DLC chapters did. For one, Silver Lining felt like a continuation. It played into Spider-Man being Spider-Man rather than using drone missions and eavesdropping missions. The missions were actually fun. There was some real character development between Spider-Man and Sable, along with each mission feeling like a spectacle in a sense. The gameplay loop was far more enjoyable, not on par with the main story, but a lot more what I expected from a DLC in a game of this caliber. All three DLCs should have felt the same as Silver Lining. And this is what really smears the good reputation and good memory I had of Marvel's Spider-Man. Whenever I think about it, I think of the botched job they did on 66% of their DLC, and the fact that this story takes place after the main narrative. The sequel won't pick up where we left off. The next story doesn't follow on from Peter finding out Miles has spider powers, but instead will pick up sometime after Spider-Man randomly got involved with Black Cat and took down Hammerhead. It all seems very odd to me after the ending we got from the main story. Talking of Miles, his handling in these DLCs was potentially the worst part. The end of the main game sets up that Miles Morales will become Spider-Man, sure, after some training from Peter, but we as fans, I think, expected the next game to focus on that and show us how Miles dealt with his new powers firsthand, showing him learning and training with Peter. But no, they didn't do that, because all the Miles progression is done over the phone in these DLCs. The first time Miles jumped from a building, him learning about what it means to be Spider-Man, it's all background noise on the phone in this DLC, and I couldn't hate it more than I do. Of course, we're going to get to see Miles train with Peter in the sequel. Of course we will, but we're not going to get to see his first time putting on a mask, his first time jumping and swinging from a building, his first time realizing he can be Spider-Man and wanting to train, because all of that is already done, it's out of the way. The point we're going to start at in the sequel is Miles already knows he's training to be Spider-Man, and I feel like that takes away a huge plot point, a narrative arc we could have explored ourselves in Spider-Man 2. All of my main narrative issues easily could have been avoided by saying this is just a set of side stories that occurred at some point during the main story. Having this set after the main story really soils what the main story did for me and the ending it left on us. Of course, this doesn't fix the issues with the DLC being boring for the most part, but that's just how things are. I've tried my best to continue to remind myself that the game is nothing like the DLC. The game is not repetitive, the game is not mundane, and the game did so much that I love. But it's hard to remember that when I'm left with these DLC chapters that absolutely sucked and feel nothing like the amazing, spectacular experience we got from the main game.